Here we go. So my name is Jessica Rucker. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'd like to say hello to everyone here on behalf of the Zen Education Project for our session on Reconstruction and Juneteenth. Some of you all are joining us for the first time, and some have participated in one or each of our sessions over the past 5 weeks, several weeks, and welcome back. I'm a high school teacher, and I regularly use lessons from the Zen Education Project, which is coordinated by Rethinking Schools and Teaching for Change. I love their resources, both online and some of their print materials. The Zen Education Project is hosting this session today as a part of the Teach Reconstruction campaign. The Zen Education Project offers free downloadable people's history lessons that many of you have used for middle and high school classrooms from the Zen Education Project website. Before I begin my conversation with Dr. Greg Carr, and that'll be the last time you hear me call him Dr. Greg Carr, we want to find out who's in the room and go through our plans for our time together. So if you would, please go ahead and rep yourself. How many teachers, librarians, teacher educators, historians, parents, students, labor or community organizers, or other folks in the room? There we go. All right. Take about 2 more seconds. We're going to close the poll. All right. Wow. 52% of us are educators. 14% are students. 2% are family members or caregivers. 2% are librarians. 8% of historians, 12% teacher educators, 3% labor or community organizers, and 9% of us are others. All right, welcome. All right, great. We are ready to start our conversation. And throughout the session, we want you to use the chat box to post questions, comments, resources, ideas. Our guest speaker and I are going to read your questions and try to respond after the breakout groups. So make sure to return. And then we're going to do a short evaluation at the end. All right. After about 20 minutes, we are going to pause so that you can meet each other and talk in small groups to share insights. And I am happy to introduce Greg Carr, Associate Professor of Africana Studies of the Department of Afro-American Studies at the real HU, Howard University, which is just right down the street from me, and adjunct faculty at the Howard University School of Law. Carr is the founder of the Philadelphia Freedom Schools movement and is an advisor for the Zen Education Project Teach Reconstruction campaign. So, Brother Greg is here, Jess is here. Let's start this conversation. All right, Greg. So June 19th, like some of my favorite MCs, has many names. It's Juneteenth, Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, even Celebration Day. What's the significance of June 19th and why does it have so many names?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you, Jessica, for not only being in conversation with me today, and for being a vital and integral part of the Zen work, the Zen education work, but also first and foremost, as John Henry Clark, my old teachers used to say, and many people on the call know John Clark, said all I ever wanted to be was a great classroom teacher. And, I want to pay Dobali to you in respect because I've seen you in action. And so, thank you for your work as a teacher. And by extension, every teacher in this conversation, polls notwithstanding, I'm assuming everybody on here has a teaching role and function. It's very interesting. Juneteenth, which apparently now is a national thing in the wake of this latest general strike against the social order. Juneteenth is one of the many emancipation rituals that people of African descent have created over the last, century and a half, really, a little bit over a century and a half. It's interesting because those rituals were created by African people. We know some of them very quickly. I mean, many people on the call know and have celebrated January 1st, which, is when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, 1863. But as many people on the call know, particularly those y'all in the North who grew up in the North, you know, the churches in the North, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, many of those churches, they prayed on the last day of December, 1862, and brought in the new year with the expectation that now it was time to get up off our knees and go get some guns or support those with guns and make this Emancipation Proclamation stand up, since it didn't apply unless you were in control of the place that you win in battles. It's one of the origins of Watch Night. And of course, I remember an exhibition, and you know, a couple of people on the line who work with the museum, the Smithsonian African-American Museum. There was an exhibit over at the Museum of American History, a temporary exhibit over there on the second floor, and they had a quote up from Silas X. Floyd, who was a minister. And of course, January 1st was the celebration day for a lot of Black people for years because of the emancipation. And the quote from Silas Floyd said, "May God forget my people if we forget this day." And that was January 1st, not June 19th. And so that's just one of many examples. You mentioned Decoration Day, of course. We think about the roots of what become Memorial Day, the idea of honoring our ancestors who made the ultimate sacrifice by placing flowers on their graves. And you see coming out of South Carolina, reminds me of the Gospel Army. There's a very good book called Conjuring Freedom that talks about that South Carolina regiment of colored troops. And that beautiful Ed Dwight monument is on the South Carolina State House grounds. You know, we talk about the Confederate flag that came off the dome, but if you ever go down to Columbia, go see Ed Dwight, because you see the Gospel Army marching in. And Decoration Day comes out of that. And then, of course, that's one of the roots of Memorial Day. And so finally, I'll kind of wrap this up, because there's so many different celebrations. What we see in Galveston, Texas in 1865 has a lot to do with really in fact, it's connected also to the Caribbean. If we look at Jeffrey, what's Jeff's last name? He wrote Rights of August 4th. He's in the history report. Jeffrey Kerr at Howard University wrote a whole book on Emancipation Day celebrations in the Caribbean called Rights of August 4th. Anybody on this call or in the conversation from the Caribbean know that in July and August, it's Emancipation Day, Trinidad, Jamaica, other places. And so, oh, I should say one other thing. We know Fred Douglass gave that word to the slaves as the 4th of July. He gave it in New York, Corinthian Hall, on the 5th of July. Because Black people and abolitionists were like, yeah, the 4th of July don't mean nothing to us. So we'll wait to the 5th and critique the 4th. And so so even that becomes a day. But in Galveston, when General Granger sailed into Galveston or marched into Galveston with those troops, the interesting thing is, and here I want to pause for a split second. James Morgan's on the call. He works with the African-American History Museum, and give respect to an ancestor who is really without price. This was a true brother, a great mind historian, and that's the great Harry Jones. Harry Jones always reminds us that while June 19th, General Granger reads the Emancipation Proclamation off that veranda in Galveston, and Black folk are like, okay, we free. Harry Jones reminds us that there were at least 9 regiments of the United States colored troop marking their way through Texas. Texas, the last of the 10 states in the Confederacy to give up. Texas, then and now, the idea that they're independent, the Lone Star State, although the Juneteenth flag explodes that star between that red and blue field. Texas, who says, we're not giving up. But Black troops, some of those same Black troops that had captured Richmond, those Black troops were now in Texas. And so while Granger makes the formal announcement on June 19th, and then a year later to the day, Black folks start celebrating Juneteenth formally, those Black troops are spreading the word with every marching foot as they come across the South. So June 19th is the official day, marking these emancipation celebration as it comes into the African awareness formally in Texas. But the dates are usually linked to whenever people found out they were free, which is why in Mississippi, places in Alabama, places in Arkansas, Oklahoma, you might see an August date or a July date. And we'll talk, in fact, I'll mention this and keep going. This is William Wiggins's book. William Wiggins wrote a book called Oh Freedom, Afro-American Emancipation Celebrations. Wiggins wrote a 2-volume dissertation, about 500 pages. This book's only 200 pages, because 300 of these pages are in his dissertation, which are just transcripts or old heads that he interviewed in the late 1970s or early 70s that talk about the Juneteenth celebrations. And then in there, that's where you see the date changes depending on when people found out in Mississippi and Arkansas and Alabama, places like that.
Wow. The dates that people found out they were free.
No question.
You know what? Some people finding out today, and that's okay. We're gonna love up on them too.
That's
so
right.
let's jump into another poll real quick. Speaking of which, with regard to Juneteenth, we want you to check off as many of these statements that apply as possible. You learned about this history in middle or high school. You didn't learn about it in middle or high school. You teach about this history because you're a teacher in middle or high school. You teach your children, or you don't teach about this yet, but you are here to learn. I love seeing the numbers tally in. So while those come in, we're going to kick off into the second question. So let's stick with June 19th, 1865. That's 155 years ago today. Give us a little context for what social relationships were like in the U.S., because you were getting there leading up to June 19th, and help us understand what elements of those social relationships have carried over to 2020 and which have not, and why.
Excellent. Very quickly, I'll recommend another text. This is Catherine Frankie's book, Repair. My friend Catherine Frankie, I'm sure there are other people on the call who know this sister. She's at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, also Columbia University. Catherine Frankie's book, Repair, talks about how, well, let's pause. I'll come back to it in a second. The field of originary violence, of course, we know, is set with the invasion of this continent. So, you know, with all due respect to folks who say, you know, the original sin of America is the enslavement of African people, if we're going to talk in the context of sin and redemption, we should probably say the original sin is the dispossession of the aboriginals, the natives of this land. And so that field of violence just continues to spread. And as Africans are brought into that field of violence as property, the resistance to that field of violence also has its markings. So the social relations in American society have always been hierarchical, if we're going to go back just to the colonial moment, meaning there's always going to be somebody on top. And whether it's Toni Morrison writing in A Mercy about how, among other things, white folks who aren't elites have to negotiate their way, whether it's John Adams during the American Revolution that says, yeah, a third of these people were for the revolution, a third were against it, and a third didn't care. There's ambivalences in white society. But what allows whiteness to emerge, of course, is that it is constructed against something else, namely non-whiteness. And at the bottom of that hierarchy is blackness. So black-white social relations are always going to be unequal in this society. Meanwhile, who are these Africans? You know, when we were doing the Philadelphia African-American history course curriculum, we said one thing we must always do, and of course this is nothing new to all educators on this call, is ask different questions. So the first question we wanted to always ask, when we're talking about, you know, black people, is who are they to each other? And then we ask, who are they to other people? So the social structure question, or who are they to other people, defines the social relations outside of black communities. But within black communities, you find black folks want freedom. They want liberation. They're going to negotiate with whoever they need to be able to preserve some sense of freedom, or as Robin Kelly, you know, who also presented in this series, would call it freedom dreams. But within that black community, there's a sense that we will maintain our humanity one way or the other. Now, let me fast forward very quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time today. So the social relations, by the time you get to the Civil War, of course, you have 4 million or so Africans, mostly enslaved in the South, in this country. You've got a handful of blacks outside the South, the black abolitionists, joining with white abolitionists and others, trying to smash enslavement. And oh, by the way, I know I ain't supposed to look at these texts all you're running, but I saw Soraya Khan noted the fact that Watch Night also is known as Freedom's Eve. I like that. Maybe we can get Freedom's Eve now, December, the last day of December, as a national holiday as well. But so there's this move to smash the slave power, so to speak. In the South, as the war jumps off out of Fort Sumter in 1860, as the Union wins battles, they've got to decide what we're going to do about these Africans. Why? Because they're freeing themselves. So they pass these contraband acts, first contraband act, second contraband act. Now we're into 1862, 1863. That's where Catherine Frankie picks up Repair. And she's kind of following in the echo of this brother as well, the great Vincent Harding, There Is a River, who talks about the fact that when you get to South Carolina, they ask these Africans, will y'all keep growing cotton for us, the Union, because we need this money to fund the war effort. But these Negroes done smashed a lot of the cotton gins. They said no more picking. So they have to negotiate with them. One of the things they offer them as incentive is, well, if you will stay here, we'll give you first dibs on the land. We'll help you get this land. That's Rufus Saxton and the rest of them. Also happens as far west as Mississippi. Davis Bend, Mississippi. That's Jefferson Davis's brother Ben had a plantation that black people ran. And when he ran off, the Union came in and tried to make a similar deal with those Africans. So the social relations by the time of the Civil War, everything's contested, everybody's negotiating. So by the time Granger gets to the Gulf, you got to negotiate with these black folks. Because guess what? Who are they to each other? They're human beings. So a guy like Jack Yates, born in Virginia, comes all the way across the continent to Texas. And in 1872, this formerly enslaved African and two other people put money down and buy an Emancipation Park in Houston that's still there today for the express purpose of celebrating Juneteenth. Jack Yates, by the way, is the name on the high school that George Floyd went to. So understand that all of this comes from a spirit of self-determination. In conclusion, the social relations between blacks and non-blacks, particularly white elites, is going to be fraught with tensions because there's a hierarchy, the same one we're trying to overthrow right now. Between the poor whites and the blacks, those poor whites who got sense enough to know that whiteness, it has no value, so therefore you need to make common cause with us. These are the white people on the border. In fact, this is one of my prized possessions. Doris Hollis Pemberton, Juneteenth at Comanche Crossing. This is one of the oldest Juneteenth celebrations down there near Galveston. You had white people celebrating Juneteenth. Why? I ain't got no money. I ain't got no beef. I'm with y'all. So, but those people, there's a different type of social relation. And so it's I mean, the tension, and of course, then finally, I should say this in conclusion. That same nine regiments of the U.S. colored troops that helped chase the Confederates out of Texas, a bunch of them Confederates went over to Rio Grande into Texas. And that happened right before Granger shows up to read the proclamation. Well, guess what? Mexico had abolished enslavement. As we see in the Zen education program, when you look on the Zen site, you'll find something that'll tell you about the origins of Cinco de Mayo. The Mexicans wasn't for that slavery. So therefore, all the relations, really, it's just a beautiful tapestry of human resistance to oppression. So I hope that's, I went on too far, but.
No, you didn't go too far. Come on, we got further to go. And you know the last story you just taught, there's this book, It's Bigger Than Hip Hop, by M.K. Sante Jr. And my students love this section on solidarity when they find that the government of Mexico opened up its borders. It was like, yo, come through. My students are like, wow, they look at each other like, yo, we've been here for each other. We've been all we got.
I'm listening, Jessica. I'm gonna pull.
Yeah, no, keep going. We're gonna publish this poll real quick. So these are the results. 7% of us learned about this history in middle school, 78% of middle or high school. 78% of us did not learn about this history in middle or high school. 22% of us teach about this currently. Shout outs to y'all. Thank y'all for holding it down. 17% of folks teach this at home. And 44% don't teach it yet, but they are here to learn and they are taking notes. All right, so we're gonna keep this conversation going just like the movement.
Before you go there, I just want to mention one other source. Gerald Horne, Black and Brown, African Americans in the Mexican Revolution. He starts in 1910, but he actually goes back before then to underscore the point you're raising. And the MK raises is bigger than hip hop, which parenthetically, for y'all, just so y'all know what kind of teacher Jessica is, she brought this whole grip of her high school students up to Howard. And we had so much fun with MK's, I remember when he was Kamala, when he's a little boy at Temple, because you know his father, Malefi, is the chair of African Studies when I was there. We had so much fun with your student, Jessica. I'm just mad now because we all talking in the computers like we all together physically. I cannot wait for you to bring some more students up because y'all read that book in ways that I'm sure even MK hadn't anticipated. But anyway, go ahead.
You too kind, Greg. You too kind, true. Brother Greg.
It's true.
Let's stick with this notion of the original sin. I want to go back to something you were saying about honoring and commemorating Juneteenth in the context of really reconceptualizing what we're doing today to displace this notion of citizenship as a prerequisite for full social equity. And that's coming from your words on Twitter.
That's wow. Here's the challenge, right? I mean, when we were talking yesterday, for those of you, you know, and you've heard Ursula on a lot of these calls, a lot of these presentations, one of the things Ursula was talking about, you know, this question of, you know, rethinking concepts. How do we change the narrative? How do we ask different kind of questions? You know, I mean, I got so inspired. I was sitting here taking notes. You know, how do we jailbreak chronology? How do we deal with these things? For folks who, and by the way, if you're on this call and you were down at the Museum of African American History and Culture last fall when the 1619 project was brought there and had the conversations, let me do two things. Number one, I'm glad you all were there. I'm glad your students were there. And let me apologize because in a split second, if I had just paused, because you see, I get to going, I would have stopped and asked every teacher in that building to stand up because we know that, you know, if not for you all, these young people wouldn't be armed with the content to do the kind of critical thinking they're doing. So I wanted to say that. But during that during that session last fall at the museum, you know, we got into a little bit back and forth. I had a little conversation, you know, with Eric Foner, the brilliant scholar, Reconstruction, 19th century history, African-American history. And his book had just come out, The Second Founding. And I thought it was, in fact, we'll talk about that in a second. But, you know, one of the things we got into a little conversation about was the Reconstruction constitutional amendments, 13, 14, and 15. We know 13, 65, and then subsequently 14th and 15th Amendments. The question of citizenship really becomes the coin of the realm for humanity in the modern nation state. Meaning if you're a citizen, you're a full human being. If you're not a citizen, you gotta be looking over your shoulder. Why do you have to be looking over your shoulder? In the modern world, are you breathing? Yeah. Did you come out of somebody's womb? Yeah. Okay, you're a human being. We shouldn't be ranking people's humanity based on their legal relationship to the state. And so we didn't get a chance to get into a lot in that session, but the point I was really trying to raise was we have to kind of echo on what Ursula was raising yesterday when we were talking, we have to rethink everything. And you know what? It's so beautiful at this moment in the history of the world. This pandemic is a tragedy, and please, everybody who's out there who's got family or friends who have suffered, if you've been sick yourself, all best energies to you. You know, all entreaties to ancestors for your continued health and protection. And we know that in the middle of this field of pandemic, this general strike against the state has unified people in ways that overflow the boundaries of citizenship. We got folks who won't go get tested because they're afraid that they'll try to collect their information. And next thing you know, they'll put them somewhere and ship them out of the country, or they'll threaten to do it, or they'll lock them up. Okay, the pandemic has hit. These people called essential workers. Now you ain't sending them to them when they went to work at Walmart, or when they delivered your mail, or when they're on the front lines trying to help people get masks. But so in some ways, the idea of citizenship has been kind of undermined a little bit in this moment of pandemic, and people are in the streets finally. So, you know, when we saw the decision that came down, in fact, it was versus University of California, which I thought was interesting. The case, the DACA case that was decided yesterday, I guess it was. Wow, it was yesterday, wasn't it? The idea then that even these institutions like the Supreme Court of the United States and the federal judiciary, John Roberts did not want to be caught out there standing on the wrong side of history. So if you read the decision, the opinion, what you'll see is he really kind of called a tech. He basically said, I didn't say you couldn't do it. I just said that you really didn't say, mother, may I? So I'm going to let you return this back and come up with a better rationale. Okay, John, I see you. That was the stated rationale, but what you did not want to do is be on the wrong side of history. That I read that as another step in where we ultimately have to come to. We have to rethink the idea of citizenship. If you are a human being in the world, you should be able to walk through this world as free and as connected to everyone as anybody else. And you shouldn't have a bar between you called citizenship that could somehow constrict your humanity and shrink it to fit some preconceived notion. Or I should say one other thing as it relates to Juneteenth. As Catherine Franke talks about in this book, the contraband acts, now you're contraband, you're in a union camp. After Juneteenth, after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the end of the war, there's a period when these Black people are not citizens, but they are not enslaved. So, you know, Professor Franke uses the word freed with a D. There's somewhere in between. And you know what? To 2020, I don't know that D has been diminished enough to the point where we should drop it. It's a lot of freed people walking around, but you know, citizenship ain't been promised to but a handful of people in this country anyway, and executed. So I'll stop it.
Oh, Dr. Carr, thank you. And you know that love is mutual. The students really appreciated how you challenged the ideas of what it means to be human. You're an incredible professor and critical thinker. And this notion of freed, like this social purgatory that oppressed people have found ourselves in have been put in, not found ourselves in, but have been put in is quite uncomfortable.
Yes.
I'm gonna try one more question before we kick it off to the breakout groups. I want us to keep on talking about this notion of humanity, of challenging citizenship, and even in rethinking boundaries, even what we call countries or nations and states. So as we speak right now, there are various protests, rallies, and other forms of direct action taking taking place across DC, these
Yes.
50 states, and almost 20 other countries throughout the world connected to the 2020 uprisings. What should we be learning from this moment, and what should we be teaching about this moment?
Woo. You know, since my dear friend Sister Deborah asked me to participate in these regular conversations, and let me pause here and say that yes, Martha Jones' Birthright Citizenship, Sister Martha was on here a little while ago. Make sure you go read that, because she's gonna walk you through all the legal fineries of what we just talked about in terms of how this citizenship thing begins to emerge. But you know, when Deborah, when you asked me, that's a question that I don't have a good answer for. In fact, let me close the phoner loop. I was writing something the other day, writing something down, and we talk about the first Reconstruction, which is what we're talking about now. And of course, you know, those of you who have availed yourself of it, the brilliant Teach Reconstruction series from Zen Ed, and Bill Bigelow, who I'll get a chance to say hello to today, who's got the couple of pieces on it in Teaching for Black Lives. I mean, that's the first Reconstruction. Now, of course, that one doesn't quite stick, so there's a second Reconstruction. Right. And now William Barber and others, and, you know, Sister Theo Harris, you know, the sisters there, you know, you two are amazing. I mean, this third Reconstruction, we're on in fact, the Poor People's Campaign starts, I think, tomorrow. The virtual version of it, I should pause there to say a Juneteenth link, 1968, June 1968, they assembled on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And in June 1968, they had something called Solidarity Day, DC. All you DC heads know the name Sterling Tucker, for example. And that was deliberately on Juneteenth to close out the Poor People's Campaign. So at any rate, when we think about this third Reconstruction we're in, I think the lessons we can learn from the previous two Reconstructions are that, and Jessica, you brought this up, you know, we were talking yesterday, maybe you say some more about this question of responses to Reconstruction, the redemption piece. But, you know, in the wake of this conflict, you try to rebuild the society. And so finally, what I think we can learn from this, I want to introduce, well, not introduce, I want to suggest maybe even another term, going through Ursula's idea, we got to rethink these narratives. If we have a first Reconstruction, a second Reconstruction, and a third possible Reconstruction going on, when we're trying to rebuild, how can we rethink the idea that Reconstruction is linked to a previous construction? Here I'm thinking about Ishmael Reed and his critique of the Hamilton piece. You know, I won't go so far as to call Hamilton brown-faced minstrelsy. And yet there, I guess I did say it. So anyway, but Farner's, the name of his book is The Second Founding. I like that. I said, okay, so if you're calling the first Reconstruction the second founding, the first one being the Declaration of Independence, I like that concept. So then can we call the second Reconstruction the third founding? And so maybe what we're learning today with this multiracial, intergenerational, multi-class wave, this social protest that's got people doing things they said they couldn't do a month ago, getting rid of the statues, throwing the flags in the ocean. They taking down Leopold in Belgium. They didn't kick the people into the water in the Thames in London. What we're watching possibly not a reconstruction, but a founding? Are we possibly, forget first, second, and third, are we possibly on the verge of founding a society rather than reconstructing one? But I think to me, that's the kind of conversation you have with a bunch of young people who have been brought into a originary field of violence that has a hierarchy they expect those young people to fit in, that they don't want to fit in because there's somebody else to each other. So maybe we change the language to founding and see where that takes us in classroom exercises.
Wow. All right. I want to honor our agreements with the time. Let's take
actually, Jessica, one more question. Can you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we are. That's exactly what we're about to do.
Okay.
And I'm on the fence about the nature of the question to ask, but there's something there about young people. There's something there about retooling our imaginations and expanding articulation, and being vigilant with our language, since language constructs realities. Tell us a little bit about the role of young people in imagination and movements, or even in this era that's historically known as Reconstruction.
Yeah. Well, I would say this very quickly, with mindful of the time. It says we're moving. These movements always work best when they're intergenerational. And we think, of course, about the famous Ella Baker speech that Sweet Honey in the Rock, but not Bernice Johnson Reagan and her comrades turned into Ella's song. To me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And I think about what Dave Chappelle said last week when he said, I'm comfortable in the backseat. These young people got it. The streets are talking. I think those two things work together in the sense that what is the role of a guide or an elder or a teacher? It isn't to be out front. If you go back all the way back to the ancient Egyptians, the position of authority is actually the back position. Like when you see the stela in ancient Egypt, you'll see if a man dies and you see his stela and you see him sitting there getting ready to meet the next iteration of reality, behind him is his partner. So you see usually her with her hands up behind him. Why? Because I'm still alive, you're an ancestor, and I'm entreating whatever's in front of you to welcome you to that side. Being in the back seat is not a position of surrender. It's not a position of you're off the battlefield. No, let those young people drive this car. And we're here to say, okay, if you make this left, I've been down that road before, or the old horse knows the road. Now you can still make the left, but I want you to make an informed decision. That's the role that teachers are making. And it's interesting for those of you, we were talking yesterday, and looking around, I got all Y.T. Walker's books back here. And I'm thinking about Y.T. Walker, who was, of course, one of the brains in Dr. King's organization, SCLC. And I'm thinking about Barbara Ransby and Ella, who writes about Ella Baker, of course, and not the first one, but a great book on Ella Baker. And what you see is these young people in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Marion Berry out of Southwest Tennessee, Mississippi, then Lemoyne Owens, so forth and so on. The students from Howard, NAG, Nonviolent Action Group, they meet up at Shaw University and they're going to start an organization. But Martin Luther King, Y.T. Walker, and them like, why don't y'all become the youth arm of SCLC? And Ella Baker's like, slow your roll. Our job need to be, to use Dave Chappelle's metaphor, we need to be in the back seat. I'm not going to drive this car, but I'm going to help them if I know the road. And what I'm not going to do is let you try to take the driver. No, the back seat. You should be in the back seat. Now, mind you, there's nobody in this conversation who's an elder, because even when we think about King or Y.T. Walker or Ella Jo Baker, we're still talking about people who, if they were on this call, might be considered younger people. So the youth movement, in conclusion, that we're seeing in the streets now, I'm thinking about my friend Katia Stitt from WPFW. She and her daughter have been out there almost every day. I mean, I go down there, and I've been down, on 16th, and I'm like, my job down here is to show support, show solidarity. If something go down, to be here in case I need to jump in something, and also to say, when we did this version back in so-and-so, here's what we learned: support, instruction, direction, and relinquish, so that we all move together. And I think that's what we're seeing in the streets right now.
Get started. But first, Greg, I wanted to say thank you so much for tithing your time and your talents. You're on fire, and I just really feel the spirit of our ancestors here with us. You're so well read, and you're reading today. So let's go into this next question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So June 19th, 1865 was approximately 5 to 6 generations ago. Since then, there have been many uprisings and other organized direct actions in the name of Black liberation. However, some non-Black people with societal position power, as of this conversation, are doing some things that some people read as a little funny. So for example, some companies are giving their employees time off. Cuomo held a briefing about proposing to make today a New York State holiday. Even the internet is telling me that the Commonwealth of Virginia has declared today a state holiday.
Well, Blackface Northern, shout out.
So what's going on? Why is this holiday, holy day, as I like to call it, now getting so much exposure? What do you make of this? And then really, what questions should we be asking ourselves about this moment? And why are the concessions, to use your language, coming so fast? What's this all about?
Well, let me, Jessica, I would say this, and for those who, I don't know if there's probably a handful of people here who were also together when, I guess it was last spring, we were over at WHUT. Jeff hosted us over there for the Reconstruction Teach-In. The energy of those conversations, I can imagine it was hard for people to extract from the rooms and come back over here. So thanks for coming back. Because those are really the meat of our time together. So thanks for coming back. Also, you know, we were in our little breakout session as everybody else was in their breakout session, and we were talking about this very thing. Professor Theo Harris was talking about it. Jean was talking about it. And, you know, these concessions, and one of the things we kind of maybe observed is that they're coming much more rapidly than they did in the past. So if we think about, and again, this is going back to something Ursula said yesterday, we were talking, if we can jailbreak time and space, and by that meaning not think so linear. I mean, of course, the first casualty will be American exceptionalism, which is fine with me. I mean, you know, I ain't asked to come over here, but since we're here and speaking English, but if we can jailbreak it, we can then look at relationships between people who never met each other, between events that took place over the arc of decades and centuries. And if we can then identify rhythms, we can then go through and see what's similar and what's not. What is, to use Amiri Baraka's phrase, the changing same, and what does appear to be different. So, and Jessica, you mentioned something yesterday. I hope you say some more about, I mentioned a minute ago, this question of after Reconstruction comes this redemption moment. What did you mean by that? I know a lot of people who study Reconstruction, but a lot of people who don't.
Yeah, the rise of quote unquote redemption, as I understand it, is always the white vigilantism, when white supremacy is leveraged through institutions and state sanctioned violence. Is this notion of like, at any moment where there's some kind of quote unquote social opportunity for Black people, there's always organized white resistance at the individual, at the institutional, at the ideological level. And so one of the questions that Professor Harris was probing at is the question that we want to get at too, is like, are we going to get some living wages out of this? You know, are we going to dismantle the new Jim Crow? So that's what I mean by the rise of redemption. Like, will we see another wave of what we're getting through this particular political era, for example, with 45?
Yes. Well, we can stipulate the answer is yes. We know we're going to see it, because capitalism ain't going nowhere without a death struggle. And it may be in its death rattle, but it's going to go out with the embers burning as brightly as it can. So we're going to say yes. Now, the speed with which we'll see these kind of nominal confessions, and there are people in this conversation who are much better read than I am with some of those early, you know, Marxists or Marx affiliated like Antonio Gramsci, you know, you start talking about hegemony and say, you know, when something is resisting hegemony, that hegemony will expand enough to kind of incorporate that resistance. So whether you're a reporter out there who will now get a promotion because they got to find the 3 non-white reporters and promote them immediately, we've seen that before. You know, we saw that in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I mean, Dorothy Gillum has written a whole book about it, Trailblazer, right? I mean, you see that. And so if that's going to happen, if we're going to see these corporations begin to make concessions, as we've seen so far, topical, nominal confessions, and then quite frankly, for those of us on this call, you know, we're in a class where, unlike folks who had to go to work today in a different kind of way, even though we know a lot of those people were in families with them, we can sit here and talk into these screens for an hour or two. Well, that means that at some point, somebody in our school building, somebody in our school district, somebody at our job is going to say, you know what? We'd like you to come in and explain the whole entirety of history through the lens of Latinx or Blacks. And could you do it for 20 minutes? And here's $25. So, I mean, some of us they're going to try to recruit us into this. We've seen that before too. This is where Booker Washington, for example, emerges in the 1890s at the same time that this redemption movement is unleashing racial terror in the country. I mean, he gives that cotton speech in 1895 in Atlanta. 3 years later, they have a coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina. I mean, so all this terror is going on at the same time. You cherry pick a few folks out to say, see, and then that's when you invent, you know, Ishmael Reed has written, Adolph Reed has written about this, you know, the whole notion of the race leader, right? The individual. We have to resist that tendency now. So if we're looking at this as a changing same and what's similar and what's different, in this moment, I think what we can do is study the Reconstruction, the first Reconstruction, study the second Reconstruction or the second founding. So look at this third moment and say, okay, when they come with the money, we need to get it to these organizations. When they come to ask me to get a speech, I'm gonna go get a speech because I'm recruiting the other people in here who have been waiting to hear something, and we're gonna pull them off this plantation in a form of maroonage. But we have to learn techniques of resistance. And finally, the most important one, which, as I said, as we were talking about, Professor Thea Harris, Jeannie raised a minute ago, the structural advantage they're going to try to seize. What Naomi Klein a couple of weeks ago on Democracy Now! Was talking to Amy Goodman. She's talking about this Green New Deal, and here's Cuomo with these guys that want to take all education online, and say, oh yeah, we're going to bring all them in. No, dude, you've been trying to do this for 30 years. We remember the MOOCs. We remember all this online learn. You think you're about to make a quantum leap, but guess what? So do we. So when you show up with the Ivy League schools that say, take all our classes for free, we showing up with Zen Education and say, yeah, take all our classes for free. And see what we're going to do now. and then of course, then finally, I think, because that's not going to help the person who loses their job in a structural realignment at a company. We've got to then identify ways to support folks, even as we continue to lobby, as we continue to practice electoral politics. We've got to continue to figure out ways to support those who are the most vulnerable, because what I think is going to end up happening is this system is probably, if it's not approaching its event horizon, is very close, and it's going to collapse in on itself. I mean, how many times have we been in meetings, all of us, where the old heads are sitting in there and they mention something from the 30s or 40s and they say, capitalism is going to collapse. And we kind of say, okay, yeah, hey, I think we might be in the moment when we're closer to that than ever before, which means we got to think differently now. And thinking differently means independent institutions, seizing the apparatus while it's available to us, and then expecting, I should say finally for sure, expecting that as this resistance continues, there are going to be other moments when the state violence reappears, reemerges, where extra police actions are taken, where the same kind of thing happens, but the system gets weakened every time. And these acts of desperation they're doing now seems to me just feed our determination not to relent.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. And to kind of build on this notion of the system getting weakened every time, there was a question about the third wave of Reconstruction or the third founding.
Yes.
In harnessing these global interpretations, you know, I'm shouting out Soweto here. How can we leverage this moment, not just here in the US, but across the globe, especially in the context of global history and how it's gaining momentum? And I think this person was also asking about in the context of higher education too, which you were starting to speak to.
Very quickly, I would say, and I was watching my buddy Robin Kelly's session that many of you all were on, and he kind of started his conversation by saying, you know, deconstructing 3 myths, you know, and I thought that's a good idea. So let me just say a couple of things very quickly at the beginning. Number one, every movement we've had in this country for equity, social justice, to strike against the general social order has always had an international dimension, including Reconstruction. In fact, when we were talking, I was saying this, I got a book around here somewhere on Reconstruction in a global context. Because remember, France and England and them are kind of sitting it out to see, because the people in Charleston, South Carolina are telling them, hey, yo, we can run all the cotton and indigo and tobacco out of Charleston. We don't even need New York City, which is why, of course, New York City, when South Carolina secedes, the New Yorkers go to the governor and say, hey, maybe we should leave with them. Do you know how much stuff we get from the South? So at any rate, there's always been an international dimension. The Africans knew that before anybody. Julia Scott's book, The Common Wind, you go back to the 16th century, all of Gerald Horne's work, there's nothing, Counter-Revolution of 1776, all that stuff. And I love Gerald because Gerald's going to be charitable to the 1619 Project. Gerald is going to always be gracious to everybody, but let's be very clear. The 1619 Project, for all the brilliant work it does, is an inward-facing project. It's a kind of domestic project with some international dimensions, but the real trick, number one, is that all of this work has always been international. And it has been the threat of international relationships that has always facilitated the most severe crackdowns on the domestic activity. The Insurrection Act of 1807 that this guy down hiding in our bunker, it was talking about. They passed that 3 years after the Haitian Revolution. They're terrified that these Negroes are going to start listening, because these boats are going everywhere, right? I mean, they coming into New Orleans, and these cats getting out the boat like, yeah, we beat their ass, and so we what you did what? Oh no, Insurrection Act of 1807. That's one of the tributaries. The same thing happens during Reconstruction. During and after Reconstruction, remember the Confederate States of America, their plan is a book, LSU Press, I forget the author, but it's called Dreams of a Confederate Empire in Latin America or something like that. But at any rate, we had to look it up. Their job, for the South to win the war, they didn't have to invade the North, they just had to keep the North out. And they wanted to run the CSA through Central America and get Latin America too. Gerald has his book, The Deepest South, or the book, The White Pacific, that deals with this question. They're trying to build an empire. The resistance is also looking internationally. Quick Juneteenth example, just by way of symbolism, and I see the time, I know we're coming up to a close. Antonio Maceo Smith in the 1930s in Dallas said he's gonna bring back Juneteenth because there were ebbs and flows after World War I. And so Antonio Maceo Smith, of course, is named for Antonio Macheo, the Bronze Titan, one of the heroes of the Cuban-Spanish War that the Americans jumped in. There's an international dimension always to the way Black people in this country have thought. Coming forward into the 50s and 60s, we were talking about that. Paul and S.E. Robeson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, the Pattersons, right? Louise Thompson Patterson, you know, and her husband, William. They have international connections. The NAACP, you know, they're gonna be domestic. So they kind of are forced away from them, or they choose to be away from them in this Cold War, anti-communism, this kind of thing. In this moment, the so-called third Reconstruction, or this second founding, this third founding, I don't think that's gonna work. That's a radical difference between technology, between the way we think about ourselves in the world as human before being a member of any particular national society. The solidarity movements, as we've seen all over the world in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the previous murders of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, the river, to use Vincent Harding's metaphor, those international solidarity movements bear strikingly similar tactics and techniques. So yes, of course they're getting rid of statues. I'm thinking about the fact, you know, how many years, Jessica, and anybody else, because you got the Soweto, okay, you'll remember, how many years are we from the epicenter of fallism in Southern Africa? I'm trying to, because it started with labor.
Just one generation, if that,
yeah,
depending on how you count. Yeah,
that's exactly right. So it started with Rhodes Must Fall. And I used to take students to South Africa every year, and we stayed on the campus of the University of Cape Town, and I would walk down to Rodney Bosch Road to get the newspapers before day of morning, and I would stop by Cecil Rhodes' statue and spit on it every time. Now I can't do it, it's gone. But Rhodes must fall. But then once they got Rhodes, they were like, fees must fall. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. And then the workers, everybody else with the students, and then they got that, and they said, okay, you know what? Rhodes must fall, school fees must fall. Let's just call it fallism. Now they're saying Rhodes must fall in Oxford. Now they say, in other words, the internationalism, and then it comes to the shores of the United States, it didn't quite penetrate. I think we might see a version of fallism. Because once the statues are gone, what else you got? Happy Juneteenth. Okay, we got that. Okay, we're gonna take Aunt Jemima out the box. Okay, we got that. Now what about my money? Well, we don't know. Oh, you thought we was going away? Y'all throwing these statues out here like some kind of artificial levee to stop this flood? No, we overflowed the statues, bruh. Where's the living wage? I think we're on that trajectory if we can keep this momentum up.
Ooh, that's right. You just made me think of Beyonce. She said, put some respect on my check. And I think that's definitely the next phase. Now, if you have to go, we're gonna keep vibing out until 3:15. Please give us some feedback on the feedback form. It's been in the chat. We'll put it back in the chat again. But I wanted to ask one more question, and then if there are other questions in the chat, we'll lift those out too. So the internet has been a buzz, and I have to help my students know the difference between credible, reliable sources.
Teach me.
You know,
you teach them, Jessica.
And the facts, yeah, it's hard. I'm still learning myself, but the internet has been a buzz with suggested readings and viewing lists and sites to make donations. You've given us an incredible amount of books to read, but do you have any suggestions about, you know, what we could be watching, organizations in addition to the Zen Education Project that we could be supporting, so that as teachers and other adults who work with young people read and review, so we can help pass on this message of liberation? Because it's not just for me to keep it to myself, but I want to keep passing it on. And I'll give you an example. We had a PSA project in my class where students were asked whether or not we should continue to support institutions that use racist caricatures. One of those came from the film Ethnic Notions. It was Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's Rice. And so students have been texting like, Ms. Rucker, I know you pressed because, you know, Quaker Oats is going to take it down. But so what should we be viewing, reading, or supporting so we can help pass this message to the young folks as they pass it to us, actually? I'm trying to keep up with my students.
You and me both. Well, I kind of, it's like that thing oh my God, today is Friday. It's actually that thing this week with J. Cole and No Name. And I was like, I can't even figure it out. Anyway, so, but there's a class critique there that I know is there as well. I'll be very candid. You know, it's like you said, it's like drinking from a fire hose, the internet. So to me, the most important, maybe it's what to look for rather than necessarily where to go. And I'm sure, you know, everybody on the call has their favorites, and I know that'll be generated too. A list will be generated and circulated. But you names in education. I think that's important because what Zen Education does is, in addition to everything else, it's a clearinghouse. So, and it's also a barometer of quality, because, you know, if you see something that Zen connects to or that Zen has, it's going to be thoroughly vetted. I mean, you see how well organized these conversations are. So there's a standard there, and then it becomes, okay, now let me transfer this standard to wherever I'm looking on the net. And if I don't see it at least approach this standard, then maybe I'll put that on my secondary list. And that allows us the freedom to roam without necessarily being direct. Because one thing I'll say, you know, and this is somebody who stays broke because I'm constantly buying books and I'm looking at stuff, and then these syllabi that are being generated. That's the big thing now. You know, Wakanda syllabus, you know, Black Lives Matter. So, okay, that's all great. And I'm thinking to myself, how many people who are writing syllabus like this are teachers? Because y'all, you know, if you're every teacher on this conversation knows the challenge we have with having our students slow that moving image literacy down enough to adjust it to these words with no pictures. So I see all the syllabi and I'm like, this is great. Now I'm trying to figure out which one of y'all is a teacher, because I don't know if you ever try to teach that syllabus, but if you have, you know, so I think the syllabus are good for us, but they don't necessarily speak to what we are trying to at least need to accomplish in the short term, which is to get our young people to do some of that. Now some of the other stuff, the moving image literacy, ethnic notions I always suggest ethnic notions. I think most people on here, probably everybody has seen it. If not, that film is excellent. And then after that, I think, to me, it's more about technique. Can you footnote a film? In other words, as you're watching the film, assume that every moment you're looking in that film is a set of narrative choices. That's the way, for example, I think we should look at, and we talked about this when we were together, PBS's Reconstruction series. It's good, but assume everything in there is a team of people's narrative choices. And I always assume that the choices they made omitted more than they included. So what's missing? Always, as students, we're always asking, what's missing? What's missing? And if it troubles your spirit, that's a signal that something's missing, because every kind of person there is today was back there. That's why when people say, you know, these people were fighting for freedom and they said one day the rights that were assigned to George Washington belonged to them, I'm saying, nah, it seemed like they ain't like George Washington in 1789. Why the hell would you come to 2020 and put them words in the mouth of people who did not like George Washington then? Oh, I see. You're making a narrative choice. So let's blow up the narrative. That's a little bit more difficult to do, I think, without guidance, which is why, again, I'll end where I started with Zen Education. I think that's very important, because in that conversation, or not conversation, I don't know if it was a beef between or whatever, between J. Cole and No Name, one of the, and if y'all know what I'm talking about, this is what me and Jessica are talking about, young people, right? So J. Cole, the entertainer, is saying, yeah, No Name, who is also an entertainer out of Chicago. Her mother had a bookstore in Chicago for a number of years. If you're from Chicago, you probably know Afrocentric Bookstore. She and Juwanza Kunjufu, African-American Images, they had 2 bookstores in Chicago. But that was a generation ago. The critique, J. Cole is saying, yeah, you got book clubs, you got people reading, it's all great, but you know, some of us ain't really read or haven't read much, and you don't need to be elitist dealing with us. And I'm like, yeah, that's true. But then there's a misogyny of sorts. There's a critique, there's a gender critique in there that's complicated that I'm trying to puzzle my way through. But the bottom line is this: you can have a book club, but how are you picking the books? I'm glad you're reading. That's the important first step. But the books we read should lead us to other books, and there should be at least initially an initial set of books, if we're gonna, or readings that allow us to guide ourselves through. But if you're just getting around reading books, you're gonna pick the book that somebody said read. So yeah, I guess that wasn't an answer, but
Hey, I love it. So we are at time. I want to first, Dr. Carr, say thank you, and thank you to our participants. And before I forget, Eyes on the Prize is also a really great go-to for me and my students.
Yes. Oh, and get this book. They got this one, right? That's the one you showed at the jump. Teaching for Black Lives.
Oh, yeah.
You gotta do Teaching for Black Lives, right?
Yeah.
Look, I pair it with the rest of my stuff. You know, I got all
baby.
My ammunition over there.
That's right. And I see the ambiance in the background. We love it. So we want your feedback on this session, both the content and the format. The link has been put in the chat box. But before doing the evaluation, please unmute yourselves and share your thank yous to each other for your commitment to learning and to teaching people's history. Please also, for our folks who are in the background helping to facilitate, show them some love, and also to Greg Carr. So go ahead and unmute yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alpha.